and today I'm going to be talking about the IB HL History course. So I would say that this was my favorite course that I took in the IB program, which is one of the reasons that I'm going into history in university. I'm going to be doing English and history. So that is the plan, and soon you will be seeing videos from my university experience. But not today. So today's video is all about my tips for the HL History course, and if you're in this course right now, it doesn't really matter whether you're in, History of Europe or whatever history course it is, although I'm sure the tips may vary a little bit depending on what type of history you're taking. I took the History of Europe course, but really any of the history courses in IB have similar exams, similar strategies that would work for studying, so let's get into it. First, I'm going to give you some more general advice for the IB History course, and then we're going to dive a little deeper and we're going to talk about each of the 3 exams and some tips for how you can study effectively for each of them. So first, you're going to want to do history consistently. I would look at history similar to math. If you don't practice it, you're going to get rusty, you're not really going to be as efficient or proficient, I guess you could say, in the course. So every day or every other day, if you can, try to do a little bit of history, regardless of whether you have homework, just keep working through the textbook or doing different tasks that may not have a deadline, but it might be a good idea if you just consistently try to get the content in your brain, because your future self at the end of grade 12 will definitely thank you when all that information is in your long-term memory instead of trying to cram it. So something that I find really helpful is making notes. And I know that most people make notes, but finding the note strategy that works for you, because there's lots of different ways to take notes, and there's lots of ways that I tried in my history course to see what worked for me. So I have all my notes linked in the description below in a Google Drive folder, which is accessible to all of you. So you can check out my notes. They may or may not be helpful because you might be taking different parts of history, but just seeing the different styles that are available to you that you can try. They're not all, super hard to do. A lot of them are very simple and look nice or don't look as nice, but they're very practical as well. There's a couple different types of styles that I would kind of categorize in my head. So you have, of course, timelines, you've got mind maps, and then you've got general content notes where you're just writing, bullet points or putting it into thematic boxes. So those are kind of the different types of notes. But then something that's really helpful is that, so of course when you're reading through the textbook, you're going to make long notes. You might type them out, you might write them out depending on what type of learner you are. But you're going to make very detailed notes. But then as time goes on, as you're studying for tests or exams, you're going to want to really condense that. And I'd say even near the beginning, you're going to want to start making one-sheets. So one-sheets are just, a single piece of paper or, a double-sided sheet of paper that you're going to put all the information from a certain topic onto. So here we have Italy's move to global war. So this is just a simple one sheet. This is something I found worked for me later on. Then I have it organized thematically right here, so you can see exactly what caused Italy to move towards global war, World War II. And then at the bottom I have a little summary, and this is a timeline. So I have kind of a small timeline that I can use to reference while I'm studying for Italy's move to global war. But there are lots and lots of different styles of one-sheets you can make. You can make them, for example, as a mind map. So for example, here's one for the Spanish Civil War, and this mind map was honestly one of the only things I used to study for the Spanish Civil War because I got it to contain pretty much everything I wanted to know about it. So here we have, different color coding. So we have political instability, economic instability, social inequalities as causes, then we have the strategy and management of the war, and then afterwards there's the different types of impacts that come after it. Then I have, of course, different statistics and dates that are all put throughout the note. So that's the first thing, finding what note-taking style works for you. And I think, honestly, just looking through my notes or looking through friends' notes or just trying out your own thing is the best way to find out what works for you, because every single person is different. People in my class did lots of varieties of styles of notes, and we all did well. So, just find what works for you. Something that I like to do, and I made a whole video on this, which will be linked above, is that I like to study using big pieces of wood. And this might not be available to everyone, so of course you could do it on paper too, but I liked to write out condensed timelines on a piece of wood, and then I would kind of talk about it aloud. I wrote it in Sharpie, and I really had to think critically about what was important and what was not important in order to make this big note on this piece of wood. Kind of a weird way to study, but it's things like this that you get creative and you find how to study for this kind of course just to get the content in your mind, because that's the thing. There are a couple things in history that are really important, and I would probably name those, especially in the IB history course, as dates, of course, and dates are very, very important. And then you have statistics, and oftentimes those kind of two things are intertwined. Then you have perspectives. So those would be historians or just, people at the time period, important political figures, and what they thought of specific events. And then conclusions. And conclusions are, what is the general understanding I need to take from this event? What is the significance of it? Why would it be important to talk about? Is it significant? So those four things, perspectives, stats, dates, and conclusions, which is linked to significance, those four things are pretty much the key things that you need to keep intertwining into your notes. And I know some people say that history is boring because you have to memorize dates. But I would just challenge you to think more of it as you need to know the dates in order to do history. So in order to be able to evaluate something and explain your point and argue something, you need to have the dates and the stats in order to back that information up. If I just told you Hitler was a bad guy, you would be like, okay, well, why was he a bad guy? How many people did he kill? What years did this happen in? For how long did this happen? And those types of information are really useful when you're trying to prove your point, because history isn't just a bunch of facts. In fact, history is almost the opposite of facts. Of course, we have things that we regard as facts, but really, it's not set in stone. Like, it's very dependent on who wrote it or what did eyewitnesses say. We weren't there. We don't have a time machine. It's not like science where we can repeat the experiment over and over again. In history, we kind of just have to go with what evidence is available. History allows us to better understand that the way that we are now wasn't just an inevitable fate. Well, there's arguments either way, but just it helps us to understand that there are lots of different ways that people live and have lived, and that our future isn't just how we have grown up. Obviously, we all have these preconceived notions for what our lives are like now and what they should be like in the future, or what our ancestors did, but really, history tells us that there are important figures or there are important events that change the course of how things are going. And that is something that brings me to my next point, which is understanding different perspectives. Because there are things like determinism and accidentalism and the great person theory. There are all these different terminology things that you want to be aware of, because it's not very evident necessarily what all these things mean. It's like in science. When I say mitochondria or nucleus, you might have a general idea of what it means, but unless you study it, you don't really know. And it's the same for history. You gotta really learn the terminology of history and how to write. I went into the IB history program knowing how to write. I had written essays before. I considered myself to be a generally competent writer. The IB history course taught me above all else how to write. And not just how to write narratively, but how to write on the other side of the spectrum with a more evaluative and analytical tone. So all of these things I think are really important. If you want to do well in IB history, it's one of the hardest courses I think to do well in. I got a 6 in IB history. I was definitely aiming for a 7, and honestly I know that what I wrote was the best I could have done, and I feel really, really proud of myself for what I wrote. So I have no regrets in that area. But if you want to do your very best in this course, it is definitely one of the hardest courses you can take in IB. So you're really going to have to put in a lot of work to bring your writing up and to understand all of the content that you need to know. Of course, there is a lot of information out there. And one of the most important things is learning how to write in a concise manner and also learning what is important. So this is learning how to prioritize information. Of course, you start out and you learn everything. You read your textbook, you look online, you ask your teacher, you learn everything that you can. And then you start to realize that you don't need to put everything in your notes. When you're really condensing your notes and getting down to what am I going to include in your essay, after you practice writing essay after essay, you'll start to realize a pattern that this type of information is useful to me, or this type of statistic will help me prove this type of argument. And you'll start to see a real pattern in that, and then those are the things that you try to really commit to memory, because you can't know everything and you really have to work on selectively choosing what you know. Of course, sometimes this backfires and you say, that is not useful, I'm not going to learn that. And then of course, that is the only thing that ever pops into your mind. But we're just gonna, push past that and just say that it's important to prioritize what information you know. And the last piece of general advice that I'd like to give you is working on reading and reading other people's work and getting people to edit your own work. Ask your teacher for help, ask your peers for help, especially the people that are really passionate about history or that, think maybe they're a bit better at this than you are, or, you're a bit better at this than they are and you can help each other out. Getting people to proofread your work or to read it over and just give you some constructive criticism is really important. You may think that you are a great writer, but everyone always has room to improve, so you're going to just want to get people to read over your work and you'll read over theirs. And of course, you're going to want to learn how to read to make it interesting. I kind of have a specific tone that I use in my mind when I'm reading things in history, because otherwise you could read it monotonously in your head, but if you read it, but perhaps another argument might be that blah, 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 and you use influxes and intonation in your voice that makes it more interesting to yourself. And it's not that, I wouldn't say it's that you have to convince yourself that it's interesting, but in order to really get the argument that the person is putting forward, you have to really understand it as if they were speaking. Like, I almost imagine it as things written in history are almost like speeches, which is not, it's not really the case, but picturing it that way can help you to understand what stresses are being made in the sentences versus just reading it, then the person went and committed murder and then in 1955 this happened. If you read it like that, it's obviously going to degrade from the understandings that you're getting, but if you read it with intonation, then you can really start to get the arguments and all that type of stuff. So I just realized this video is going to be pretty long, so I hope you stick around, especially if you're looking for tips. But in the description box I will have timestamps that say when I'm going to be talking about paper 1, paper 2, and paper 3. So if you're looking for a specific set of information, then definitely go check that out. But now we are moving into paper 1. So paper 1, more than both of the other two exams, is an exam where you really have to study the format. Since you only have an hour to write the exam, you have to know how much time to allot to different questions. So I always try to leave at least half an hour for the last question, because question 12, so I call it question 12 because I did, questions 9 through 12 because of the part of the curriculum I was learning. But the last question that you answer, let's put it that way, is going to be kind of a mini essay. So I always did it with an intro, 2 body paragraphs, and then the conclusion. But that means that you have to leave time to do a little bit of a plan for that so you can get in some of your own information as well as the information from the sources. So in terms of paper 1, you really want to use the first 5 minutes effectively. So that first 5 minutes is the time that you are going to use to read over the questions, and then you're going to look at what sources are in the first and second question at least, and you're going to try to read those and then formulate an answer in your head so that within the first 5 minutes you've already written the first question, part A and part B. And you also have to know how it's marked. So I would really suggest looking at the rubric for paper 1 just because it's very specific in how it's marked, and if you don't know the format, that would be a little challenging. So for the first question, part A, it's always out of 3 marks, and you're going to give 3 different points. So you're going to say, according to source, blah, blah, blah. And then you're going to give 3 reasons or 3 pieces of evidence for what you're saying. Firstly this, secondly this, and thirdly this. And you might include a quotation from the source in that, and that would be kind of useful. But other than that, yeah, you want to make sure you get in your 3 points and try to do this in 2 or 3 minutes at the very most, try to get that question done super fast. Don't even do a plan for that, just write it down. And then for the second question, you're also going to do that one pretty fast. Normally it's something about the message. So you're going to say something like, the message conveyed is blah, blah, blah because of this. A lot of times it's nice to give 2 sentences for this answer, and the second sentence is going to say something like, due to the fact that there is this imagery, this means that blah, blah, blah. So you're just going to be giving kind of an extra thing about either imagery if it's one of the sources with images, or you might be quoting something, and then that can prove it, what you said in the first sentence. So you're often going to want to do 2 sentences for that just to get your 2 marks. Then for the next question, you're going to be giving values and limitations of the source. And so in this question, you're going to want to give 2 values, 2 limitations because it's out of 4 marks. And within this, you're going to want to talk about the origin, purpose, and content. And when you're doing this, make sure you say explicitly, a value lies in the origin. I would suggest kind of working on this to get really good wording that you can use in almost any source, because you can say, the origin has cultural knowledge because the author was from Japan and the source is depicting Japan's involvement in this. And then you can, as a limitation, say, the purpose may be more subjective because it's from the perspective of someone who worked in the government at the time and was trying to, persuade its audience. So that's the type of thing that could be really useful. You're going to want to really explicitly signpost that terminology in there to get your 4 marks. So then the next question is a compare and contrast, and so you have 2 different sources and you're going to want to have 3 similarities, 3 differences. Sometimes you can do 2 and 4, but overall you're going to want to have 6. And so within these similarities and differences, sometimes you might want to do a planning table for this, but honestly, by the time I got to my exam, I was just able to read the sources and then on the spot say, these are similar because of this, and be very explicit. Say things like, a first similarity is this, secondly, this is another similarity, or you then say, a difference lies in the fact that both of the texts vary in this manner. And within each of the values and limitations, I would suggest using at least 1 reference to the text. So use a quotation or something about what was in the text, because then it can really prove what you're talking about. But anyway, 3 points of each, then that one takes a couple minutes. And by the end of all of these couple questions, you're going to be left with just the last question, which is kind of an essay answer. So it's kind of like paper 2 and 3, and you're just going to be answering it in a little essay format with about 2 body paragraphs. That's normally what I did. And I would do a little plan for my essay, so I would write out what was my main thesis that I was using for the whole essay, and then within the first and second body paragraphs that I was doing, or the first sections, whatever you want to call them, you have to mention all 4 sources. So I would try to mention either 1 and 3 or 2 and 2, and I would say source J, and then what I was going to talk about and why it was relevant to that point specifically. So you're going to get in those sources either 2 and 2 or 1 and 3, and then you're going to add in a bit of your own knowledge to support your answer. So paper 1, I think, was the easiest of the 3 exams for history because you get sources and you just have to know some of your own knowledge, but it is really important you know the format so you don't run out of time. Yeah, that will really pull you down. So I would not suggest running out of time. Yeah, not a great idea. Okay, so now we are moving on to paper 2. Paper 2 was the one I think I worked on the most throughout my time in IB history because you just gotta learn how to write the essays and how to answer certain questions. So I would really suggest looking at all the different types of questions because there's a different way to write each essay based on whether it's an examine or to what extent, or compare and contrast, discuss, I think I'm forgetting one, evaluate. All of those different types of questions have different formats of answers. For example, for discuss, you're going to want to talk equally about different sides and then prove your point. Anyway, these are the different types of questions, and I would suggest looking those up on the internet and talking to your teacher to figure out what they think is the best way that you can answer each of those questions. I'm not going to go through all of them, but definitely that is something to look into. Oh, I think I should mention this. So for paper 1, the subject that we did was the move to global war, and then for paper 2, the subjects that we did were the causes and effects of 20th century wars, and also the rise of democracy in South Africa and India specifically. Basically for paper 2, you write 2 essays in a 1.5 hour period. So within your essay, you're going to have 2 to 4 sections / body paragraphs, and you're going to be just proving your consistent main statement thesis that you talk about in the introduction, and then you consistently refer back to it throughout the whole essay. And you're using statistics and dates and perspectives that are relevant to your argument in order to prove your point. So something that's really helpful for this is making nice summary notes. So I'll show you what I did. For example, here I have the emergence of democracy in South Africa. So I have everything that you could kind of ask about that in my most important political factors, social factors, and economic factors. You know, I have the effectiveness of democracy in India. And then I talked about education, healthcare, and the employment. So once you practice a lot, and once you're pretty well through the course, and even when you're not that well through the course, I think something that's really important that I didn't really realize till closer to the end was the importance of conclusions and questions. So yes, past papers are important, but for the paper 2 and 3, honestly, you can predict all the possible questions that they will ask. Just let that sink in. You have the ability to predict every single question that IB could ask you. So if you go into the syllabus for IB history and you look at the different bullet points that you need to know for the subjects that you're taking in history, you are able to format the questions from that. So I have this document here where I put all the different questions that were possible on here based on the prescribed content for each of the different sections, and then I would write out questions. Some of these I took from past papers, some of them I made up on my own. Over here in topic 9 for paper 2, I had evaluate the importance of external influences on the emergence of 2 democratic states. Or here there's to what extent were 20th century wars caused by the same issues. So I made this document near the end of IB, and this was honestly my savior. Like, it was like the best idea I think I've ever had. Okay, that's a hyperbole, please, that is a hyperbole. So then within this notebook, some of them I did on paper, but then I literally filled this notebook doing every single one of those questions. So I just went through. Let's just see that this is filled with answers to questions. It's just filled with me timing myself for 5 to 8 minutes. I would give myself the question, use the information in my brain, and I would write an essay outline. So my outline would have my conclusion, which the conclusion is kind of what I say for the thesis. So what is my judgment on the topic? And then I would have 2 to 4 points that I'm going to talk about in my essay. I would make outlines, and then what I did, which I think is a really useful idea, is I went through and I typed out all of these conclusions, and then I annotated them with the important stats and historians and perspectives and dates that I would use if I was writing that answer. And then that was what I studied from closer to the date. So here, for example, I have some conclusions, and I would just go through, this is all linked below, and then I would annotate it, and I would write down the most important things using my brain, using my notes. Studying with friends is really great for that. And you can also type it. So here, for example, for paper 3, I have started typing the important stats because writing it was taking too long. But yeah, using those conclusions and then annotating them and doing lots and lots and lots of practice outlines timed is going to get you ready so that when you get to the paper 2, you can whip out an outline for an essay in 5 to 8 minutes, and then you just write. And you give yourself about 45 minutes per essay, and you just write it. So that's the best tips that I can give for paper 2. And then finally, we have paper 3. So paper 3, you write 3 essays in a period of 2.5 hours. So at first, I was very intimidated by this, and you think that you need to know 3 topics to write a question from each one, but I only actually studied 2 of the sections from paper 3, and then I chose 2 from one and 1 from another. I found that was the easiest way for me. And then as you go through, you'll also realize that some of the content you learn in paper 2 and whatnot will prepare you for some of the other paper 3 questions, so you might even have a possibility of choosing a question from another section. But anyway, so the topics that I did inside of paper 3 content was Russia. So this is Russia from 1924 until 2000. Of course, it's the Soviet Union for a lot of that. So we did that, and then also the interwar stuff. So that's what happens between 1919 and 1939, between the wars. So especially for paper 3, the bullet points are your best friend, and you're going to want to know all of them and try not to ignore any of them. So for example, for Russia, there was a thing about Stalin's propaganda, something that I didn't look at first, but as I went on, I realized that propaganda is a great point that you could use in almost any essay about Stalin. So in my actual final essay, one of my main points was about propaganda. And of course, I learned that later on because I didn't think at first that it was that useful. But yeah, look at all of the bullet points. And then finally, one last thing I wanted to mention was, as you go through the program, you'll make lots of different types of notes, but something that's really important to make a note on is the most important statistics and the most important perspectives. So here I have all the most important statistics that I was kind of using for paper 2, different wars, 6 million people unemployed in Germany in the Great Depression, blah, blah, blah. It has tons of statistics like that. But then this one I used a lot at the very end of the course, which I made, and it was all HL history perspectives, paper 1, paper 2, paper 3. And these perspectives were just so useful because having it all in one place and just having quotes that you had memorized or that you knew a couple words that you had used in previous essays and you could then use in your final essay or just kind of paraphrase what they mean by their perspective is something that's really useful. So I would suggest for paper 2 and paper 3, look at conclusions, annotate them with the most important information you have that you would use in an essay answer, and secondly, know your perspectives because those are just so valuable. They're just so valuable to you and you're going to want to know them. Obviously, you don't have to memorize long quotations, but if you can know just like 2 words said by that person, like I still remember that Margaret Macmillan said about the Weimar Republic that it was a dictated peace, and so that's why a lot of German people were not happy with that. Anyway, there are lots of perspectives out there, and you'll find what's most useful for you. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. I'm kind of exhausted from filming it. I'm gonna go take a nap or something. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. I hope that these tips were helpful. I'll definitely be making more videos about history in the future because I'm going to study in Geneva, Switzerland. I'm studying history, and the courses that I'm taking just seem so incredibly interesting, and I'm really excited. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!